This is lecture 6B. So I talked last time about the foundation of the Qin and Han dynasties and how those created a stable classical era society that had enormous trade and a unified central government and unified a much larger territory. Well, along with the formulation of these new governments and larger societies in classical societies, you also typically see the creation of a new social philosophy or religion. And we saw that with Zoroastrianism emerging with the Achaemenid Empire in Persia, and we're going to see that again with Hinduism emerging along with empire in India. Here, I want to talk about how the emergence of empire in China also saw the creation of several new social philosophies or religions. So I want to talk about three today. Now, two of them are pretty much social philosophies. They're not really religions. One of them could be called a religion. But all of them were sort of ways of organizing society, ideas about how to organize society that emerged right about 500 BCE, largely in response to the formation of classical societies. So what we tend to see is that when you start seeing societies make this leap to a much larger, more complicated society and government, you also see the emergence of a religion or a social philosophy that tells people how to act and keeps society stable and orderly, even though it's a much bigger society. So the first idea I want to talk about is called legalism. And legalism emerges through a series of writings by many people in the late Warring States period. And legalism is really just a government philosophy on how to run a society. And in particular, legalism has several key components. And the assumption behind legalism is that society is constantly in danger of falling into chaos, and the government has to proactively prevent any sort of chaos or any sort of disorder, because once disorder gets started, it feeds on itself and turns into total disaster and collapse. And so legalism is built on this idea. The first thing you need is really strict laws. You need laws for everything. You need laws regulating everything so that there's a rule for everything, and every time somebody wants to do something, they know there's a rule for what's the right way to do it and what's allowed. Right? So legalism creates a really strict sense of laws that are really detailed in a lot of cases. And so a lot of people don't like legalism precisely because it creates laws for everything, and it feels like you can't do anything. Right? There's no personal freedom. But then legalism couples that with harsh punishments. They give really harsh punishments for what most societies would consider to be minor infractions, get really serious punishments under legalism. And so lots of people really hate legalism because of that. And I should point out that legalism, some major legalist scholars in history got lynched by mobs because they hated the ideas so much. Like a legalist scholar would become a government official and would try to implement these policies, and the mobs would lynch him because they hated him so much. And legalism, by the time the Qin dynasty was founded, legalism had a sort of a really bad odor about it. Nobody wanted to touch legalism officially. But a lot of the techniques of legalism really work pretty well. And so lots of times people would officially embrace Confucianism, but they would use legalist techniques when push came to shove. They just wouldn't officially embrace legalism or say that's what they were doing. The last part of legalism that's a really key idea is the idea of a strong army. The government has to have a strong army to restore order and to maintain order in society, and they have to be willing to use the army both to defend the country against outsiders and to put down disorder inside the country. But legalism had a fairly sophisticated idea about how you build a strong army, and the idea was that the government needs tax revenues to build a strong army. And tax revenues, the best source of tax revenues is from taxing land and the harvest. And so the government should actually carry out a series of policies to try to increase agricultural production so that they could increase taxation on agricultural production so that they could pay for an army. And so legalism has a fairly sophisticated idea that the government has to sort of manage the economy and boost productivity in order to be able to fund an army that's big enough to maintain order in society. So legalism in that sense is often very useful, and this part of legalism is the part that often gets taken up by other Chinese governments. They just don't want to call it that. They don't want to call it legalism because these two things give legalism such a bad odor that they don't want to talk about it. But legalism is there in Chinese society, and these ideas of legalism keep sneaking into government policies, and clearly a lot of government officials are using legalistic policies and even terminology without acknowledging legalism. And so legalism is a major force in shaping government policy in China for centuries to come. In fact, all the way up, I mean, I think you could actually say that there's traces of it in China, in the Chinese government today. But it's never really embraced after the Warring States period as an official ideology because it's so morally repugnant in some ways. The second big ideology, or this one's really sort of a religion, is Daoism. And Daoism emerges. The Tao Te Ching is the sort of founding text here. Daoism emerges at about this same time, coming out of the Warring States period and into the early Qin dynasty. And Daoism is a philosophy that's really for personal behavior. It's a personal moral philosophy. And the central idea of Daoism is that everything in the universe is an orderly system. The universe has a natural way of functioning, the laws of nature, if you will. And this is the Tao, or the way. Okay? And so the way is the way that the universe wants to function. It's the natural cycle of things, of life and death and birth and growth, etc. And human beings have a choice to make. They can either work with the Tao, understand how the universe works and the way things go and the proper course of life. And if they do that, everything works pretty well because it's sort of like the way is a river and it's flowing along, and you can swim against the current and try to swim against the river, or you can just float with it. And if you float with it, it's easy, right? And Taoists say that the problems come when human beings try to move away from the Tao, or the way. And so if you try to found a big empire, if you try to create new inventions, if you struggle against the natural course of things, it often goes badly, right? You get famine and disease and chaos and accidents and destruction and death. And so for Taoists, the path of wisdom is to figure out what the Tao is, to identify what's the proper way to live in harmony with the universe, with the forces of life, with the way things are going, and then to be content with that. That is the path that you should follow, and if you follow that path, it goes well. But if you move away from that path, if you struggle against that path and try to change it, things will go wrong. Right? So Taoism is a kind of a passive philosophy in the sense that, I mean, one of the central ideas is you don't strive to make things better. You don't strive for personal accomplishments or anything. You simply identify the natural course of things and content yourself with that. Now we're going to see later that Taoism has some points of similarity with Buddhism. And when Buddhism arrives in China, it would actually, in many ways, mix with Taoism. And in particular, lots of Chinese scholars, when they wanted to explain Buddhism, would use Taoist words like the Tao to explain it. But that's for a later lecture. I'll talk about that when we get to Buddhism, etc. For right now, Taoism becomes a major sort of social philosophy or religion that people adopted. And you can see why. In the Warring States period, there's all sorts of chaos and there's all sorts of suffering, etc. And people were looking for a way to find peace in the middle of all that. And Taoism sort of becomes a philosophy for how you find peace and make yourself happy when everything is going to hell, right? So Taoism is a very personal philosophy. Legalism was a government philosophy about how to run society and how to run the government. Taoism is a very personal philosophy about how to live your life. But you can see that Taoism and legalism are totally opposed to each other, because Taoism says basically find the flow and go with it and don't struggle to change things, and legalism says put forth maximum effort to totally control everything and make it do what you want, which is the exact opposite of Taoism. The last philosophy I want to talk about is the big one, Confucianism. Confucianism is a Western term. It's a corruption of the name of Kung Fuji, who was the first thinker in the Confucian tradition. But I want to point out, Kung Fuji lived at the end of the Warring States period, 551 to 479 BCE, and he's actually just before the Warring States period, but he's in a period of decline in Chinese society. And Kung Fuji lays down the foundations of Confucianism, but then later scholars in the early Qin dynasty and then would elaborate on it, articulate more parts of it. So the fully formed version of Confucianism doesn't emerge until the Qin dynasty. And then we'll see later that there's even new waves of reform within Confucianism later in Chinese history. But for right now, I'm going to sort of talk about it as if Kung Fuji just developed the whole thing. So Kung Fuji, he basically said, society's kind of falling apart here. The Zhou dynasty is in decline, and right after his death, you would see the Warring States period begin, and then things really fall apart. And that's part of why his philosophy became so popular, because he seemed to have an answer to the Warring States period. So Kung Fuji said, well, how can we create a good, stable, functioning society that functions smoothly? And he said, well, the first thing is you want a society that doesn't have a lot of conflict. So how can you avoid conflict? And he said, well, conflict seems to emerge when you have two people who have different opinions about what should happen. Or to put it slightly differently, if it's not clear who gets to decide what happens, right? If two people both think they get to decide, you're going to have conflict because they're not going to agree most of the time. But if it's clear that one person gets to decide and the other person has to obey that decision, then you won't have conflict, right? Or to put it slightly differently, if everyone's roles are clearly defined so that everybody knows in any given situation who's in charge, who's making decisions, and et cetera, then you won't have conflict. And you'll have a smoothly functioning society. So the key then, Kung Fuji says, is you have to clearly define everybody's role in society and make it absolutely clear in every situation who's in charge, who's making the decisions, and who's doing what. And then if you do that, society can run smoothly because everybody is fulfilling their proper role and everything gets done. So Kung Fuji then says, okay, at the heart of this then, we need to define everybody's roles. And so Kung Fuji articulated what he called 5 relationships. And he said these are the foundations of society to define everybody's roles. The first relationship is, he says, wives are subordinate to husbands. And by extension, women are subordinate to men. And so he basically says that in a marriage, the wife must be entirely obedient to the husband because the husband is totally in charge, right? And we're gonna see this when we get into the third reading for this course, Banzhao, Instructions for Chinese Women and Girls. You can see where this is going. But so basically, women should be entirely subordinate, or wives should be entirely subordinate to their husbands, and by extension, women are subordinate to men, all other things being equal. That's the first relationship. The second relationship is children are subordinate to their parents. That children must be completely obedient to their parents. And Kung Fuji took this, it's not just you got to do what your parents say. It's that no matter what your parents say, you don't even question it, right? So if your father says, hey, let's burn down the house, the son says, I'll go get the kerosene and the matches, right? It's supposed to be an absolute, utter obedience, right? And the phrase they use for this is filial piety, which sort of implies that you hold your father as in sort of godlike reverence. So that's the second relationship, is that children are utterly subordinate to their parents. The third is that younger siblings are subordinate to older siblings, and by extension, the young are subordinate to the old. Okay, so all things being equal, if two people are the same status and everything, one of them's younger than the other one and one's older, the older one is in charge. Okay? And so there's a reverence for age. So that's the third relationship. The fourth is that the lower classes are subordinate to the upper classes. right? And so there's a class system built right into Confucianism, and the idea is that if an aristocrat says something, then a merchant is going to have to obey him, or if a merchant says something, a peasant is going to have to obey him. So that's four of the relationships. The fifth one is that friends are equals. But if you look at the first four parts, that means that friends really have to be the same sex, the same age, and the same social class in order to even make friendship possible. Because if they're not the same age, the same sex, and the same social class, then there are subordinate relationships, and friends are equal, so they can't be friends, right? And so the assumption then is that friendship is clearly defined by age, class, and gender, right? And so essentially what Kung Fu Ji has done here is he's laid out this idea that in every situation, if you look at the sex of the people involved, if you look at the ages and you look at social class, you should be able to figure out exactly who's in charge and who's not. And the person who's not in charge should give absolute obedience to the people who are in charge. And if that's the case, you'll never have social conflict, right? The only time you could have social conflict is between friends, but they're friends, right? So this is the central idea of Confucianism, is that if we can organize the society this way, we can avoid all social conflict. But how do you do that? How do you get everyone to buy into this, right? In particular, how do you get young women who are sort of the bottom of the totem pole to buy into this? Well, Kung Fu Ji argued that the key to it was that the people at the top of the pyramid have to behave well. And so you could sort of say morality flows downwards. And the key for this, Confucius says, is the gentleman, the junzi. The junzi, is the upper class sort of aristocratic man who's a landowner and the head of a family, etc. He's sort of at the top of those hierarchies, especially if he's older. And the idea is if he fully embodies all of this, he can maintain the moral code with everybody below him. But the real key is that the junzi has to be a paragon, an absolutely perfect example of this sort of morality. Everybody has to admire him and say, yeah, that guy has got it, right? And in particular, what Confucius says is that the junzi has to have three characteristics, three qualities: Ren, Zhao, and Li. And Ren is the idea of benevolence to those below you. It means kindness and generosity, but it also means taking a sort of sense of responsibility, taking care of the people below you. And it's not too far off of the idea of the old 1950s father in family who takes care of the wife and children, the father knows best kind of thing. This is the idea, though, that by all means you have to be kind and considerate to those below you. You don't abuse your power. You don't abandon people if they don't serve you anymore. You take care of them. If you have a servant who serves your family for years and then they get sick, you keep them in your household and you feed them and you give them a place to stay. You don't throw them out on the street because they can't work anymore. Right? So Ren is this idea of benevolence to everybody below you. Shao is the idea of filial piety or respect to those above you, that you give absolute obedience and respect to everybody above you. And the central idea here is that you owe your parents, in particular your father, this absolute respect and piety. You don't question anything he says. If the shunzi does this, if he respects the emperor, if he respects the high government officials, etc., he shows everybody below him how you're supposed to act to people above you. Right? And so Shao is basically the idea that you show the proper respect and obedience to everybody above you. And then Li is the idea of propriety. It's the idea that you have to do things the right way. And a lot of Confucian writings actually get into some weird stuff, like they talk about the detailed instructions about how to decide what kind of gift to give somebody who's slightly above you in social status or slightly below you, and how to sleep and how to dress and how to do personal hygiene. But the idea is that there is a proper way to do it that makes you clean and orderly and respects all the relationships and maintains the stability of society. And so it's about personal manners. It's about how ostentatious you are in terms of clothing. It's about spending money. It's about doing everything the right way. Right? So Confucianism, the gentleman then is supposed to be totally benevolent to those below him, totally obedient and respectful to those above him, and he's supposed to have a sort of a social grace to always know exactly, when to say something and when to not say something, what kind of presents to give to maintain relationships, how to be a good host, how to dress well without being too ostentatious, how to be clean, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the idea that if the gentleman, who's sort of the aristocrats, the wealthy at the top of society, can do that, then they can sort of teach the rest of society how to act, and they can act as moral examples, and then everybody will see these gentlemen are such wonderful guys who do everything perfectly and are so right and benevolent and kind and generous to those below them and respectful to everybody above them, that everybody else, the women, the lower classes, the young, will see that and will say, yeah, I want to obey that person. Right? This is the central idea of Confucianism. And so Confucianism, this idea that there are these social classes that have to be maintained and social harmony is necessary, and that everybody has clearly defined roles, is a social philosophy that becomes the foundation of Chinese society. As the Qin and Han dynasties get bigger and bigger, and you get more and more trade, and people are moving around, and you have bigger cities, people don't always know how to act, but Confucianism provides a sort of social philosophy. In every given situation, here's how people are supposed to act. So it acts as a sort of a glue holding a bigger society together.